So art is all around us. You got music, movies, paintings. Art is like everywhere in modern day pop culture, and especially with the advent of the internet, consuming art and finding your exact niche of content that you like is like the easiest that it's ever been. But have you ever really stopped to wonder why we enjoy art in the first place? I mean, it's interesting that out of all the animals on Earth, humans are some of the few that actively create just for the sole purpose of self-expression. And of course, there's art that people generally seem to like, and there's also art that people just don't really like that much. So for as varied in style and medium something like art is, there's clearly some kind of method to the madness, right? There's some kind of subconscious rules that dictate whether a creation is good or bad. Well, as it turns out, the answer to that question is a little more complicated than I thought. So for this media theory assignment, I ended up reading this article, How to Be a Moderate Optimist About Neuroscience in Film Theory and Other Places by William Seeley, who should probably try to have a shorter name for his next article. And through Seeley's research and explanations, I realized that the answer to the art question is basically spectrum. So Seeley brings up the idea of media theory optimism and pessimism, which are two opposing viewpoints on just how significant neuroscience and just like the study of human behavior and response is on the interpretation of art. So in other words, can science be reliable for determining how art will be interpreted by an audience? So on one end of the spectrum are the extreme optimists, who basically say that science with enough research can be used to consistently predict audience interpretation of art and define whether or not it's a good or bad thing. So for example, an extreme optimist would argue that by studying Star Wars, the Titanic, and Moana, you could pinpoint consistencies between the movies and determine exactly why people seem to like them so much. They'd say that eventually neuroscience would be able to explain the exact specifics in the directing and the editing and the framing that makes these movies good in a way that make the research replicable in the future. So if when I mentioned these three movies, you thought to yourself, oh, that seems kind of unfair, these movies don't really have that much in common, then you'd be making the argument of the extreme pessimists, who are at the other end of the spectrum. So these guys argue that art is too abstract in form and it's too personal to the consumer to have any kind of consistent results in audience reaction, and that neuroscience really just doesn't have that much to offer in the study of art interpretation. So the thing that Seeley brings up in his article that I more or less agree with is that both of these appropriately named positions on the spectrum have views that are too extreme to answer the art question. On one hand, art definitely is too broad in form and abstract in execution for audiences to have predictable reactions to different types of art. But on the other hand, there are standards in art that exist because they are reacted to positively enough to be considered the norm. So I'll go back to that last thing later, but for now, I want to talk about Cactus Plant Flea Market. So Cactus Plant Flea Market is a streetwear brand that was created by Cynthia Liu in 2015. So since then, the brand has become huge in the streetwear and hip-hop scene, and it has some pretty big collaborations with Pharrell and Kids See Ghosts, and even McDonald's a couple of years ago. They have a really unique aesthetic where everything looks really poorly drawn, but it's also really intentional at the same time. It's a style that shouldn't really work, but it kind of does anyway. Okay, here, check this out. This is a hoodie from their collaboration with McDonald's last year, and when you look at this, you probably think, wow, that's really stupid, and you're right, but also, you're wrong because it's actually really cool. And I'm not the only one who thinks this, because if you want one of these McDonald's hoodies right now, you have to pay up like $350 for it. Like, these are not cheap. So when I read Seeley's article, it made me think of this clothing brand of all things, because I think that this clothing brand proves that both extreme optimists and pessimists are both wrong. So like, why are people paying hundreds of dollars for a crayon drawing of the McDonald's logo on a hoodie? It's because designs like these are unique and they're out of the box. And nowadays, we're so used to seeing clean and rendered and to the point logos from so many other clothing brands that it's really noticeable when this brand has a hoodie that has this crudely drawn, off-centered one instead. Designs like this are out of the box, and to be out of the box, that means that there has to be a box in the first place. So that means that extreme pessimists are wrong, because clearly if brands having professional-looking logos on their clothing is the norm, to the point where a brand going against that design choice is notable, then the trend of professional-looking logos on clothes was art that yielded a consistent, neutral, or positive response from people. And neuroscience can explain this because clean centered logos are visually pleasing to the eye. But if that's the case, then why is it so cool when a design goes against this? Because if actively going against common trends to make a statement on acceptable design is just as, if not more well-liked than the norm, then that means that extreme optimists are wrong too. Because Cactus Plant Flea Market is definitely not for everybody, but a lot of people, myself included, really do like this aesthetic, despite what neuroscience says I'm supposed to find visually pleasing. So this brings us back to Seeley's main point in his article, which is basically just that the most important labels on the spectrum aren't the two extremes, but are moderate optimism and moderate pessimism, and he focuses a lot on moderate optimism. These people understand each other's point of view, but believe to just varying degrees that neuroscience can account for some of how art is interpreted. I think this is probably the most reasonable of the positions to hold on the art question, because it's important to recognize that just as much as neuroscience can help explain human behavior, art is sometimes just too personal to be confined to a few theories or explanations. And Seeley focuses a large part of his article, especially towards the end, of the idea of moderate optimism and pessimism relating to film in particular, because film is a medium that has a lot of standards in camera work and editing and color grading, because these are tangible elements that the audience can have a reaction to. These have norms because history determines which of these methods audiences find the most visually pleasing, and Seeley calls this diagnostic recognition framework for engaging art. He's basically just saying that human sensory motor functions enjoy things like specific editing techniques because it makes it easy for us to understand what's going on in the scene without it getting in the way. So for example, when two characters are talking, cutting behind the shoulder of each character while the other is talking is a pretty common technique because it showcases the conversation effectively and it doesn't become too distracting or hard to follow. So like dialogues are rarely shot in full because it's awkward to have a conversation between just two individuals if the camera's filming the entire space. So lining up media theory with optimism, neuroscience more or less explains why this technique is visually appealing, but at the same time, it's important to remember that movies break this norm all the time for like narrative reasons and stylistic choices, and audiences still love them, so neuroscience can't explain it 100% of the time, it only designates when it's the norm. So these are the reasons that Seeley argues moderate optimism is the most effective viewpoint to have on this like spectrum, and while neuroscience should account for the core qualities of art that makes it appealing, having flexibility in those boundaries and the abstractness in the interpretation is the key, and the neuroscience perspective shouldn't be taken so rigidly. So the answer to the question of what makes art good or bad is basically that it's just a really strong case-by-case basis. Some people will like design choices that others won't, obviously, and neuroscience won't always be able to explain why when we have such varying tastes in art as humans. But it's, it's just more important to appreciate it and understand why certain stuff works in art and others don't, and try to learn from that, than it is to define all of art, which is super broad, into just a few categories and make theories that try to explain everything when it's just too situational to have one explanation for.